The year was 1871, and mercy was a luxury few could afford on the Texas frontier. In the dusty settlement of Cedar Ridge, where justice came from the barrel of a gun and survival meant choosing sides, no one expected a legend to begin with a dying child's whispered prayer in a language they couldn't understand. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the scrubland, Wien. The young running wolf felt the first bullet tear through his shoulder. The 14-year-old Comanche boy had been tracking a wounded deer for miles, following its blood trail through mesquite and prickly pear. When the settler patrol found him first, Benjamin Crawford raised his rifle again, his weathered face set in grim determination. 3 other men flanked him: Mason Fletcher, a cattle rancher whose livestock had been stolen twice that summer; James Whitman, a shopkeeper whose brother had died in a Comanche raid; and young Tom Bradley, barely 18 but eager to prove himself among the older men. "Please," Running Wolf gasped in broken English, the words his grandmother had taught him for trading. Blood seeped through his fingers as he pressed them against the wound. "No harm, only hunt." Crawford spat into the dust. "Your people burned out the Morrison family last month. Killed the baby too." His voice carried the weight of too many funerals, too many graves dug in the rocky soil of Cedar Ridge. "Not me," Running Wolf whispered, his dark eyes darting between the 4 rifles trained on him. "Not my band." Fletcher stepped forward, his boots crunching on dried grass. "Doesn't matter which band, boy. You're all the same when it comes down to it." He glanced at Crawford. "We can't let him go back and report our patrol routes." Running Wolf had grown up hearing stories of white settlers from his grandfather, windwalker tales of broken treaties and burned villages, of his people driven from their ancestral hunting grounds. But he had also learned of individual kindness, of settlers who traded fairly and kept their word. He had believed, foolishly perhaps, that understanding was possible. Now, watching Crawford's finger tighten on the trigger, he understood that some wounds ran too deep for healing. The boy had awakened that morning in his family's tipi, 3 miles upstream along the Brazos River. His mother, Moonsong, had been grinding corn while his little sister, Bright Star, played with a doll made from corn husks. His father, Stone Bear, and the other warriors had left before dawn to scout for buffalo herds that had grown increasingly scarce. It was supposed to be a simple hunt. Running Wolf had taken only his bow and a handful of arrows following game, trails he had known since childhood. The wounded deer had led him farther from camp than he intended, deeper into the disputed territory where Comanche hunting grounds met settler claims. The patrol had been tracking him for an hour before making their move. They had seen the smoke from his small cooking fire where he had stopped to rest, had watched him through spy glasses as he cleaned his arrows and checked his bowstring. To them, he was not a boy following an ancient tradition of providing for his family. He was a scout, a threat, evidence of Comanche presence in what they now considered their land. "My father will look for me," Running Wolf said, switching to his native tongue when the English words failed him. He repeated it in English, his voice growing weaker. "He will come." "Let him come," Whitman muttered. "We'll be ready." Crawford studied the boy's face, noting the defiant tilt of his chin despite the fear in his eyes. "How old are you, boy?" 14 summers, Running Wolf replied, his grandmother's English lessons serving him even now. "Old enough to ride with war parties," Fletcher observed. "Old enough to die like a warrior," Crawford agreed, but something in the boy's bearing gave Crawford pause. There was no hatred in those dark eyes, no savage fury that the stories always described. Just fear and pain and a desperate will to live that reminded Crawford uncomfortably of his own son, killed 2 years ago by fever. The boy had been 15. "We should take him back to town," Tom Bradley spoke up suddenly. "Let Judge Morrison decide what to do with him." The three older men turned to stare at the youngest member of their patrol. Bradley's face flushed red. But he continued, "He's just a kid, Ben, and he's hurt bad." "Kids grow up to be warriors," Fletcher said coldly. "Warriors who kill our families." "Maybe," Bradley said. "But that hasn't happened yet." Crawford's jaw worked as he weighed the options. Cedar Ridge had been built on harsh necessities, on the understanding that survival sometimes required terrible choices. But it had also been built by men who believed in law, in the idea that civilization meant something more than mere survival. "He's bleeding out anyway," Whitman observed. "Probably won't make it to town even if we tried." Running Wolf's vision blurred as shock began to set in. The bullet had torn through muscle and sinew, and he could feel his strength ebbing with each heartbeat. The morning that had begun with such promise, the prospect of bringing home fresh meat for his family now seemed like a distant dream. He thought of his sister's laughter, of his mother's gentle hands braiding his hair before hunts, of his grandfather's stories told around winter fires. He thought of the sacred places his people would visit in the spring, of the buffalo dances and the honor songs, of all the things he would never see again. The men argued above him, their voices fading in and out like distant thunder. He caught fragments. "Too dangerous. Mercy. What if it were your boy?" But the words seemed to come from very far away. Crawford made his decision with the weight of command that had kept his men alive through 2 years of border warfare. "We leave him. No bullets wasted, no blood on our hands. The land will do the rest." "Ben," Bradley protested. "It's decided," Crawford said firmly. He looked down at Running Wolf one last time. "Boy, if your God is listening, you'd better start praying." They took his bow, his arrows, even the small knife his father had given him on his 13th birthday. They left him only his torn clothes and the growing pool of blood beneath his shoulder. Running Wolf listened to their horses' hoofbeats fade into silence before allowing himself to acknowledge the full extent of his situation. He was miles from his band, gravely wounded and completely alone in hostile territory. The sun was climbing higher, promising a scorching day that would drain what little strength he had left. He tried to stand but collapsed immediately, his legs refusing to support him. The wound in his shoulder throbbed with each movement, and he could taste copper in his mouth. He needed water, needed shelter, needed help that would not come. The boy closed his eyes and began to sing, softly, a death song his grandfather had taught him. It was a warrior's right to choose how he faced the end, and Running Wolf chose to face it with the dignity his people had shown for countless generations. Hours passed. The sun reached its zenith and began its descent toward the western horizon. Running Wolf drifted in and out of consciousness, his lips cracked and bleeding, his body racked with fever. In his delirium, he saw his grandfather approaching, translucent and glowing, beckoning him toward the spirit world. But Windwalker's ghost spoke words that confused him. "Not yet, grandson. Your path leads elsewhere." As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Running Wolf heard something that couldn't be real: the creak of wagon wheels, the gentle lowing of oxen, the soft voice of a woman singing a hymn he didn't recognize. He forced his eyes open, expecting to see another vision, another trick of his dying mind. Instead, he saw a plain brown dress, worn boots, and gentle hands reaching toward him with impossible tenderness. The woman was perhaps 40 years old. Her auburn hair streaked with premature gray and pulled back in a simple bun. Her face, weathered by sun and sorrow, showed no fear as she knelt beside the wounded Comanche boy. Her blue eyes, the color of winter sky, held only compassion. "Dear Lord," she whispered, her voice carrying a slight Irish accent softened by years in Texas, "what have they done to you, child?" Running Wolf tried to speak, to warn her away, to explain that helping him would bring danger to her door. But no words came, Only a weak whisper that might have been gratitude or apology. The woman widow Catherine O'Malley, the running wolf, didn't know her name yet, had been returning from her monthly trip to Cedar Ridge for supplies. She had seen the buzzards circling from a mile away and had prayed she wouldn't find what she expected. But finding a wounded child, enemy or not, left her no choice at all. "Easy now," she murmured, examining the bullet wound with experienced hands. She had tended enough injuries during her 15 years on the frontier to know what she was looking at. "We need to get you out of this heat." With surprising strength for her size, Catherine managed to half-carry, half-drag Running Wolf to her wagon. She made a bed for him among the flour sacks and blankets, positioning him so the wound wouldn't reopen with the wagon's movement. As her oxen began the slow journey toward her homestead, Catherine found herself making a choice that would change both their lives forever. She was harboring a Comanche warrior boy or not, he would be seen as an enemy by everyone in Cedar Ridge. She would be branded a traitor, a fool, or worse. But as she looked back at the unconscious child, his face peaceful despite his injuries, Catherine O'Malley knew she would face any consequence. Rather than leave him to die alone in the wilderness, her own son would have been about this boy's age, if the fever hadn't taken him 3 winters ago. Her husband Patrick would have understood her choice. He had always said that mercy was what separated civilization from savagery, no matter what others believed. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As the wagon wheels turned toward home, Catherine began to plan. She would need to hide the boy until he healed, would need to figure out how to communicate with him, would need to somehow bridge the gap between 2 worlds that seemed destined for eternal conflict. Behind them, the buzzards found only empty desert and drying blood, their patient vigil unrewarded. But ahead, in a small cabin hidden among the live oaks, a legend was about to begin, not with violence or conquest, but with the quiet courage of a woman who chose compassion over fear. The sun set over the Texas plains, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold, as if the heavens themselves were blessing this unlikely alliance between sworn enemies. In her wagon, Catherine O'Malley hummed an old Irish lullaby while a Comanche boy fought for his life, neither of them knowing that their meeting would become the stuff of legend in Cedar Ridge. The boy's fever would break 3 days later. His first coherent words would be a mixture of gratitude and confusion. And Catherine O'Malley would discover that saving a life was only the beginning of a journey that would test everything she believed about justice, family, and the true meaning of home. Catherine O'Malley's homestead sat in a natural hollow surrounded by ancient live oaks, their twisted branches creating a canopy that filtered the harsh Texas sun into dappled patterns of light and shadow. The cabin itself was modest, 2 rooms built from native stone and timber, with a wide porch that faced east toward the sunrise. Patrick had chosen this spot for its isolation, far enough from Cedar Ridge to avoid unwanted visitors but close enough to reach town when supplies ran low. Now, as Catherine guided her oxen down the familiar trail, she was grateful for that isolation in ways her husband had never intended. The boy had remained unconscious throughout the 3-hour journey, his breathing shallow but steady. Twice she had stopped to check his pulse, her fingers finding the rapid flutter of a heart working too hard to keep life flowing through a body losing too much blood. The makeshift bandage she had fashioned from her spare petticoat was already soaked through, bright red against the white cotton. As the cabin came into view, Catherine felt the weight of what she was undertaking settle fully upon her shoulders. She was about to bring a Comanche warrior into her home, into the sanctuary she had shared with Patrick and their son Michael before fever had claimed them both. The walls that held their memories would now shelter someone the entire territory considered an enemy. She unhitched the oxen with practiced efficiency, her movements quick and purposeful. Every minute mattered now. The boy needed immediate medical attention, and she needed to prepare for the complications that would surely follow his presence here. Catherine had learned frontier medicine by necessity, the way most women did, when the nearest doctor was 3 days' ride away and winter storms could last for weeks. You learned to set bones, stitch wounds, and fight fevers with whatever remedies you could gather from the land. She had saved Patrick's life twice, once from a rattlesnake bite, once from an infected cut that had turned septic. But she had lost Michael despite everything she knew, and the failure still haunted her quiet moments. This time would be different. It had to be. She managed to carry Running Wolf into the cabin, his slight frame surprisingly light in her arms. The fever was building. She could feel the heat radiating from his skin even through his clothes. She laid him on Michael's old bed, the one she hadn't been able to bring herself to dismantle, and began cutting away his torn shirt to examine the wound properly. The bullet had torn through the muscle just below his left shoulder, missing the bone but creating a ragged channel that was still bleeding despite the hours that had passed. Worse, she could see the telltale red streaks beginning to spread from the edges. Infection was already setting in. Catherine had seen similar wounds during the border conflicts. Some men survived them, others didn't. The difference usually came down to how quickly they received care and how strong their will to live proved to be. This boy had been bleeding for the better part of a day, and his slight build suggested he didn't have much strength in reserve. She heated water over the fire, added salt and whiskey to create the strongest antiseptic she could manage, and began the delicate work of cleaning the wound. The boy stirred as the alcohol hit the torn flesh, his eyes fluttering open for a moment before unconsciousness claimed him again. But in that brief moment, Catherine saw something that gave her hope, not the resigned acceptance of death she had seen in too many faces, but the fierce determination of someone who refused to surrender. Working by lamplight, she removed fragments of cloth and debris from the wound channel, irrigated it thoroughly, and applied a poultice made from willow bark and honey, ingredients that had served her well in fighting infection. She bound the shoulder tightly, immobilizing the arm to prevent further damage, and covered him with her heaviest quilts to help his body fight the fever. Only then did she allow herself to consider the full magnitude of what she had done. Boy was Comanche, that much was obvious from his dress, his hairstyle, the intricate beadwork on his moccasins. In Cedar Ridge, that single fact would be enough to justify his death. Judge Morrison, whose own grandchildren had been killed in a raid 2 years ago, would see any aid given to a Comanche as treason. Sheriff Davies, a good man but one who answered to the townspeople, would be forced to act if anyone discovered what she had done, and discovery seemed inevitable. Catherine lived alone, but not in complete isolation. Father Miguel came by monthly to check on her spiritual welfare. Doc Harrison made occasional visits when he was traveling between settlements. The supply wagons from Cedar Ridge followed the main road that passed within a mile of her property. Any of them might notice something amiss: smoke from her chimney. At odd hours, extra washing on the line, the sound of voices when there should be only one. She could send word to the Comanche bands, try to arrange for the boy's family to retrieve him. But that would require contacting people she had no way of reaching, and the boy was far too injured to travel. He needed weeks of care, not days. She could take him to Cedar Ridge and turn him over to the authorities. But that would mean certain death for the boy, if not from his wounds, then from the rough justice that frontier towns dispensed to captured enemies. The memory of Michael's gentle face rose in her mind, and she knew she couldn't condemn another mother's child to that fate. Or she could do what every instinct told her was impossible: keep him here, heal him in secret, and somehow find a way to return him to his people without arousing suspicion. As the night deepened, Catherine found herself pacing the cabin's small confines, weighing options that all seemed to lead to disaster. She had enough supplies to last through winter if she was careful, enough isolation to avoid casual visitors, enough medical knowledge to give the boy a fighting chance. But she also had enough experience with frontier justice to know what would happen if her secret was discovered. The boy's fever spiked near midnight, his body racked with chills despite the heavy blankets. Catherine bathed his face with cool water and spooned small amounts of willow bark tea between his lips, fighting the infection with every tool at her disposal. His delirium brought forth words in his native language, sometimes angry, sometimes pleading, sometimes simply heartbroken. She didn't need to understand the words to recognize the pain in them. "Mother," he whispered in English during one lucid moment, his eyes unfocused but searching. "Where?" "Hush now," Catherine murmured, smoothing his damp hair back from his forehead. "You're safe. Rest." He studied her face with confusion, as if trying to reconcile her presence with his memories. Then his eyes drifted closed again, and he sank back into the fevered darkness. Catherine spent that night in the chair beside his bed, dozing fitfully and waking every few minutes to check his breathing. She had done the same thing during Michael's final illness, holding vigil against death with nothing but her will and her prayers as weapons. This time felt different, though less like a desperate last stand and more like a quiet rebellion against the cruelty of the world. Dawn brought new challenges. The boy's fever had broken slightly, but he was still far from stable. More concerning, Catherine could hear riders approaching from the direction of town. 2 men by the sound of their horses, riding at a leisurely pace that suggested a social call rather than an emergency. She recognized the voices before she saw them. Sheriff Davies and Father Miguel, likely making their monthly rounds to check on the scattered homesteads. Catherine quickly pulled a blanket over the boy's head and arranged pillows to disguise his form, then stepped onto the porch to greet her visitors before they could enter the cabin. "Morning, Catherine," Sheriff Davies called out, touching the brim of his hat. He was a tall man with kind eyes and a graying beard, someone who tried to balance justice with mercy in a land that didn't always allow for such luxuries. "Hope we're not disturbing you." "Not at all, Sheriff. Father Miguel." She nodded to the priest, a small man with weathered hands and infinite patience. "What brings you out this way?" "Had some trouble yesterday," Davies explained, dismounting slowly. "Patrols. Found signs of Comanche activity about 5 miles from here. Thought you should know to keep your rifle close." Catherine's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her voice steady. "What kind of signs?" "Blood trail, mostly. Looks like one of them got wounded and headed this direction before circling back toward the river." Davies studied her face carefully. "You haven't seen anything unusual, have you? Smoke where there shouldn't be, horses you don't recognize, anything like that?" "Nothing," Catherine said, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth. "Been quiet as always out here." Father Miguel stepped forward, his dark eyes gentle with concern. "You should not be alone during such times, my daughter. Perhaps you could stay in town until this threat passes?" "I appreciate the concern, Father, but this is my home. Patrick would have expected me to protect it." Davies nodded slowly. "Can't argue with that. Just promise you'll fire 3 shots if you see anything suspicious. We'll have patrols in the area for the next few days." After they left, Catherine slumped against the cabin door, her legs weak with relief and terror. 3 days of patrols meant 3 days of constant vigilance, of hiding the boy's presence while nursing him back to health. One careless moment, one unexpected sound, and both their lives would be forfeit. She returned to the boy's bedside to find him awake, his dark eyes alert and focused despite the fever that still gripped him. He had understood enough of the conversation to know the danger they were both in. "You should not ... He began in halting English, then switched to his native tongue in frustration. "Should not what?" Catherine asked gently. He struggled with the words, his face contorting with effort. "Should not ... help, dangerous for you." Catherine felt something unexpected stir in her chest, not just compassion, but genuine affection for this brave child who worried about her safety even while fighting for his own life. "Let me worry about the danger," she said firmly. "Your job is to get better." Over the following days, the pattern established itself. Catherine would tend to his wounds, monitor his fever, and keep watch for approaching riders. The boy would drift in and out of consciousness, sometimes speaking in his own language, sometimes attempting English, always maintaining a dignity that impressed her despite his vulnerability. The infection began to retreat by the fourth day. The angry red streaks fading as the willow bark poultice did its work. His appetite returned gradually, first accepting small sips of broth, then bits of bread softened in milk, finally asking for real food with a mixture of hunger and embarrassment. But as his body healed, new challenges emerged. The boy was restless, anxious to be gone before his presence brought disaster upon his rescuer. He tried to leave twice, once making it as far as the porch before collapsing from weakness, once falling unconscious in the doorway as his overtaxed body finally rebelled. "My people will search," he told her after the second attempt, his English improving daily through necessity. "They will find me here. Bring war." Catherine understood his fear, but she also understood that sending him away in his current condition would be tantamount to murder. He needed at least another week of rest before he could survive the journey back to his band, and even then he would need help to make the trip safely. The solution, when it came to her, was both simple and terrifying in its implications. If the boy couldn't leave safely, and if keeping him here indefinitely was impossible, then perhaps there was a third option, one that would require courage, cunning, and a fundamental transformation of everything both their peoples believed about each other. As she watched him sleep peacefully for the first time since she had found him, Catherine O'Malley began to formulate a plan that would either save both their lives or destroy them completely. The boy would heal, that much she was certain of now. But what happened after that would require them to rewrite the rules of a conflict that had been raging for generations. Outside, the Texas wind carried the scent of rain and the distant howl of coyotes. Inside the cabin, a Comanche warrior and an Irish widow began the slow process of discovering that their supposed differences were far less important than their shared humanity. The legend was still being written, one careful choice at a time. By the end of his first week at Catherine's homestead, Running Wolf had begun to understand that his rescuer was unlike any white woman he had ever encountered in the stories told around Comanche fires, the tailies. His grandfather Wind Walker spoke of settlers who feared his people, who saw them as demons to be destroyed or obstacles to be removed. But Catherine O'Malley moved through her daily routines with a calm competence that suggested she had made peace with dangers that terrified most of her kind. She rose before dawn each morning, her movements quiet and efficient as she rekindled the fire and prepared breakfast. Running Wolf would watch through half-closed eyes as she worked, marveling at the unconscious grace with which she handled tasks that kept them both alive. She checked his bandages with gentle hands, changed his bedding without fuss, and somehow managed to make nourishing meals from simple ingredients that reminded him of his mother's cooking. But it was the small kindnesses that surprised him most: the way she would hum Irish melodies while working, the care with which she positioned his blankets to catch the morning sunlight, the patience she showed when teaching him English words he struggled to pronounce. These were not the actions of someone fulfilling a grim duty, but of someone who genuinely cared about his welfare. "Why?" he asked her one morning as she brought him breakfast eggs from her small flock of chickens, bread warm from the oven, honey that caught the light like liquid gold. Catherine paused in arranging the tray, understanding that the question went far deeper than mere curiosity. "Why did I help you?" Running Wolf nodded, his dark eyes serious. "Your people, my people. War." She settled into the chair beside his bed, her own breakfast forgotten for the moment. "I had a son once, Michael. He would have been about your age now." The boy waited, sensing that this explanation mattered in ways he was only beginning to understand. "When Michael was dying of fever, I would have given anything for someone to help him. Anyone. I wouldn't have cared what color their skin was or what language they spoke." Catherine's voice grew soft with memory. "I found you dying, and I thought about what I would want someone to do if you were my son." Running Wolf considered this, turning the words over in his mind like stones polished smooth by water. In his culture, children belonged not just to their parents, but to the entire band. Everyone had a responsibility to protect the young, to ensure the survival of the next generation. Perhaps this woman understood that truth better than most of her people. "Your son," he said carefully. "Where?" Catherine pointed toward the window, where a small wooden cross was visible among the live oaks. "He's buried there, beside his father. The fever took them both the same winter." The boy was quiet for a long moment, absorbing this revelation. She had lost her family the same way his people lost theirs, to forces beyond human control, to the random cruelties that made no distinction between Comanche and settler, warrior, and child. "I am sorry," he said finally, the English words feeling inadequate for the depth of sympathy he wanted to express. "Thank you," Catherine replied, and something in her voice suggested that his condolence meant more to her than the formal platitudes she had received from well-meaning neighbors. As his strength returned, Running Wolf began to help with small tasks around the homestead. At first, Catherine protested he was still healing, still weak from blood loss and fever. But the boy persisted with the quiet determination she was learning to recognize as characteristic of his nature. He couldn't lift heavy objects or do strenuous labor, but he could help prepare meals, tend the small garden, gather eggs from the chickens. The work revealed unexpected common ground between their cultures. Both peoples understood the rhythms of the land, the careful balance required to coax sustenance from soil and weather. Running Wolf showed Catherine how to weave grass into stronger baskets, how to identify edible plants she had overlooked, how to read signs in the sky that predicted rain or drought. In return, she taught him the intricacies of her garden, the patience required to nurture domesticated crops, the satisfaction of preserving food for lean times. Their conversations grew longer and more complex as his English improved. Running Wolf proved to be a quick learner, absorbing new vocabulary with an intelligence that impressed Catherine. He was particularly fascinated by her books. Few Comanche had ever seen written language, and the idea that knowledge could be preserved on paper seemed almost magical to him. "This tells stories?" he asked, running his fingers carefully over the pages of Catherine's Bible. "Stories, yes. And teachings, rules for how to live a good life." "Like grandfather's stories," Running Wolf said thoughtfully. "But grandfather dies, stories die. This ... quotes, he gestured at the book, stays." Catherine nodded, recognizing wisdom in his observation. "Would you like to learn to read?" The boy's eyes widened with surprise and hunger. "You would teach? If you want to learn." The reading lessons became a daily ritual, conducted in the afternoon when the danger of unexpected visitors was lowest. Catherine started with simple words, using objects around the cabin to illustrate meaning. Running Wolf proved an eager student, his mind quick to grasp the relationships between letters and sounds, between written symbols and the growing vocabulary of English words he was mastering. But it was during these quiet lessons that Catherine began to understand the true complexity of the young man she was harboring. Running Wolf possessed an intelligence that went far beyond mere cleverness. He asked probing questions about the world beyond his experience, showed genuine curiosity about settler customs and beliefs, demonstrated a moral sophistication that challenged her assumptions about his people. "In your Bible," he said during one lesson, "it says to love enemies." Catherine looked up from the page they had been reading. "Yes, it's one of the most difficult teachings. Your people read this?" "Most of them, yes." Running Wolf frowned, clearly struggling with a contradiction. That troubled him. Then why do they hate mine? The question hung in the air between them, unanswerable in any way that wouldn't expose the hypocrisy Running Wolf had identified. Catherine found herself genuinely examining her own people's behavior for perhaps the first time, seeing it through the eyes of someone who had been on the receiving end of their justice. People find it easier to love enemies they've never met, she said finally. The ones far away, who don't threaten their families or their land. But Jesus knew enemies who threatened him. Catherine nodded slowly, impressed by the theological insight. He was killed by his enemies, in fact. And still said to love them? Even then. Running Wolf absorbed this in silence, his young mind wrestling with concepts that had challenged theologians for centuries. Your people think my people have no God? Many do, yes. We have a Creator, made all things, all people. Love you all. He looked at her directly. Same God, maybe? The simplicity of the question struck Catherine like a physical blow. Here was a boy barely out of childhood, raised in what her people considered heathen savagery, casually proposing a theological unity that her own church had never seriously considered. If he was right, if the God she worshipped was the same Creator that Running Wolf's people honored, then everything about the conflict between their communities was wrong. These conversations, profound as they were, took place against a backdrop of constant vigilance. Catherine had developed an elaborate system of hiding Running Wolf's presence whenever unexpected visitors appeared. A loose board in the cabin's floor concealed a space just large enough for a person to hide, though it was cramped and stuffy. She kept clothes and bandages hidden in various locations, ready to be concealed at a moment's notice. Most importantly, she had trained Running Wolf to recognize the sound of approaching horses and to disappear instantly. No matter what he was doing, the system was tested repeatedly. Sheriff Davies made 2 more visits, each time asking about Comanche sign and each time accepting Catherine's assurances that she had seen nothing suspicious. Father Miguel came by to check on her spiritual welfare, spending an hour discussing scripture that took on new meaning now that Catherine was seeing it through Running Wolf's eyes. Supply wagons passed close enough to the homestead that their drivers sometimes stopped for water and conversation, requiring Catherine to maintain a cheerful facade while her heart hammered with anxiety. Each successful deception increased Catherine's confidence, but also her awareness of how precarious their situation remained. Running Wolf was healing faster than she had dared hope, his young body responding well to good food and rest. Soon he would be strong enough to travel, strong enough to return to his people and resume his life as a Comanche warrior. The prospect should have brought relief. Instead, Catherine found herself dreading the day when she would have to say goodbye to the remarkable young man who had brought such unexpected purpose to her solitary existence. It was during his 3rd week of recovery that Running Wolf made a request that changed everything. I want to see town, he announced one morning as Catherine changed his bandages. Absolutely not, she replied immediately. It's far too dangerous. Not as Comanche, he said patiently. As your nephew from back east. Catherine nearly dropped the roll of clean cloth she was holding. That's impossible. You look like my grandfather's grandmother. She was Mexican, taken in a raid. I have her eyes, her skin. Running Wolf touched his face thoughtfully. Cut hair, different clothes, I could pass. The audacity of the idea took Catherine's breath away. It was true that Running Wolf's features were less distinctly native and some the Mexican heritage he claimed gave him a complexion that could be explained in various ways on the Texas frontier. But the risk was enormous. If anyone in Cedar Ridge recognized him as Comanche, both their lives would be forfeit. Why would you want to take such a chance? She asked. Running Wolf was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. I want to understand your people. See how they live, what they believe. Cannot learn from stories only. And if you're discovered? Then I die as I would have died in the desert. But maybe I learned something first. Something important. Catherine studied his face, seeing the same stubborn determination that had kept him alive through bullet wounds and fever. She was beginning to understand that Running Wolf possessed a quality rare in any culture, the courage to question everything he had been taught, to seek truth even when it threatened comfortable assumptions. "It would mean cutting your hair," she said slowly. "Dressing like a settler, speaking only English. I understand. People would ask questions about your family, your past. You'd need a complete story, one that wouldn't fall apart under examination." Running Wolf nodded eagerly. "You teach me, I will learn." Catherine looked out the window toward the distant smoke of Cedar Ridge, imagining the catastrophe that would unfold if their deception was discovered. But she also imagined something else: the look in people's eyes if they could see past their prejudices, if they could recognize the intelligence and humanity in the young man she had come to care for like a son. "We have to be very careful," she said finally. "Very patient, one mistake." "I understand," Running Wolf repeated, his eyes shining with anticipation. And so began the most dangerous phase of their unlikely partnership, the transformation of a Comanche warrior into a settler boy, a deception that would require them to fool an entire town while risking everything they had come to mean to each other. Neither of them realized that this audacious plan would be the first step toward something far greater than mere survival. They were about to embark on an experiment in understanding that would challenge every assumption Cedar Ridge held about the nature of their enemies and ultimately transform a wounded boy into the legend the town would never forget. As Catherine began planning the details of Running Wolf's metamorphosis, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were crossing a threshold from which there would be no return. But looking at the hope in his eyes, she found she didn't want to return. For the first time since losing her family, she was genuinely excited about the future. The unlikely savior was about to become something even more remarkable, a bridge between two worlds that had forgotten how to see each other as human. The transformation began with a haircut that felt like death. Running Wolf sat perfectly still on Catherine's porch, his long black hair falling in raven strands around the chair as her scissors worked methodically through what had been his pride since childhood. In Comanche culture, a warrior's hair was sacred. Each braid told stories of battles fought, honors earned, visions received. To cut it was to sever connections not just to his appearance, but to his very identity. "Tell me about your nephew," Catherine said softly, trying to distract him from the enormity of what they were doing. "The one from back east who's coming to visit his poor widowed aunt." Running Wolf forced himself to speak in the careful English they had been practicing for weeks. Joseph O'Malley. 16 years old. Parents died of cholera in St. Louis. Uncle Patrick's brother's son. Never been to Texas before. "And why are you here now?" "Looking for work. Heard there were opportunities on the frontier." His voice caught slightly as another length of hair fell away. "Aunt Catherine was kind enough to take me in while I look for employment." Catherine paused in her cutting, studying the emerging face beneath the shorter hair. The transformation was more dramatic than she had anticipated. Without the traditional Comanche style, Running Wolf's mixed heritage became much more apparent. His features could indeed pass for Mexican, or perhaps Mediterranean olive skin. That spoke of Southern European ancestry rather than Native American heritage. "You'll need to remember to call me Aunt Catherine in public," she reminded him. "And you'll need a complete history of your life in St. Louis. What did your father do for work?" "Blacksmith. Taught me the trade before he died. That's why I'm good with horses and metalwork." They had spent hours constructing this fictional past, layering details that would withstand casual questioning, while providing explanations for any skills or knowledge that might seem unusual. Joseph O'Malley was a young man shaped by loss and hardship, seeking a new start in a land that promised opportunity for those brave enough to seize it. The final step in the transformation required clothing that would mark him as a settler rather than a warrior. Catherine had been altering her late husband's garments for weeks, taking in waistbands and shortening sleeves to fit Running Wolf's slighter build. The rough cotton shirt, wool trousers, and leather boots felt foreign against his skin, but they completed the metamorphosis from Comanche boy to Irish immigrant. When Catherine finally held up her small mirror, Running Wolf barely recognized the face looking back at him. The stranger in the glass had short brown hair combed in the settler fashion, clean-shaven cheeks, and the sober expression of a young man who had seen too much hardship for his years. Only his eyes remained unchanged, dark, intelligent, and carrying depths that no disguise could hide. "Joseph O'Malley," Catherine said quietly. "What do you think?" Running Wolf Joseph touched his shorn head with wonder and something like grief. "He looks like someone I might have been," he said finally, "in a different life." Their first expedition to Cedar Ridge was planned with military precision. Catherine would drive her supply wagon as she did every month, but this time she wouldn't be alone. Joseph would remain quiet during their initial visits to town, speaking only when spoken to, observing everything while revealing nothing that might betray his true identity. The night before their departure, Running Wolf performed a private ceremony in the oak grove behind Catherine's cabin. He burned sage and sweetgrass, offering prayers to the four directions and asking his ancestors to forgive him for what he was about to do. He wasn't abandoning his people. He told himself he was trying to understand their enemies well enough to find a path toward peace. But as he watched the smoke rise toward the stars, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was crossing a threshold from which there might be no return. The journey to Cedar Ridge took 3 hours by wagon, following a rutted trail that wound through mesquite country and occasional stands of post oak. Catherine filled the time with careful coaching, drilling Joseph on details of his fictional past and warning him about the people they were likely to encounter. "Judge Morrison is the one to watch," she explained as their oxen plodded steadily eastward. "He lost family to Comanche raids, and he's never forgiven you, the Comanche people. He has strong opinions about anyone who shows them sympathy." "What? About Sheriff Davies?" "A good man, but he enforces the law as the town sees it. If someone identified you—" Catherine left the sentence unfinished as they crested a low hill. Cedar Ridge spread before them like a collection of children's blocks scattered across the prairie. The town boasted perhaps 300 residents. Their homes and businesses clustered around a central square dominated by the courthouse and a white-steepled church. Smoke rose from dozens of chimneys, and the streets bustled with the controlled chaos of a frontier community going about its daily business. To Running Wolf, it was like looking upon an alien world. The rigid geometry of the buildings, the straight lines of fenced properties, the way people moved with purpose along defined paths, everything spoke of a culture that sought to impose order upon the natural world rather than live in harmony with it. "Remember," Catherine whispered as they approached the first buildings, "you're shy. New to Texas. Let me do most of the talking." Their first stop was Miller's General Store, where Catherine conducted her monthly business with practiced efficiency. Joseph stood quietly beside her, arms folded, studying the shelves of manufactured goods with carefully controlled amazement. Bolts of machine-made cloth, tools forged in distant factories, preserved foods in metal containers. The abundance was staggering compared to the subsistence lifestyle he had known. "Mrs. O'Malley," Ezra Miller called from behind the counter, his round face creased with curiosity as he noticed her companion. "Don't believe I've met your friend here." "My nephew Joseph," Catherine replied smoothly. "Patrick's brother's boy from St. Louis. He's come west looking for opportunities." Miller studied Joseph with the frank assessment frontier merchants gave all potential customers. Lot of young men heading west these days. "What kind of work you looking for, son?" Joseph cleared his throat nervously, remembering to speak with the slight Irish accent Catherine had taught him. "Anything honest, sir. I've some experience with blacksmithing and horses." Figure there's always need for that kind of work on the frontier. Might be right about that, Miller agreed. Jake Peterson's been talking about taking on an apprentice. You might want to speak with him. As they conducted their business, Joseph observed the intricate social rituals that governed settler interactions. The careful politeness, the indirect way information was exchanged, the subtle hierarchies that determined who spoke first, and who deferred to whom. It was as complex as Comanche protocol, but organized around entirely different principles. Their next stop was the blacksmith shop Miller had mentioned, where they found Jake Peterson shoeing a horse with practiced skill. The smith was a large man with arms like tree trunks and a permanently sooty face, but his manner was gentle as he examined the horse's hoof. Ezra Miller said you might have work for a young man with smithing experience. Catherine called out. Peterson looked up, wiping his hands on a leather apron. Depends on how much experience we're talking about. You know anything about horseshoes, boy? Joseph stepped forward, studying the horse's leg with genuine interest. Some, sir. My father taught me the basics before he died. One can see this one. Favoring his left front, probably throwing the shoe because it's not seated properly against the frog. Peterson's eyebrows rose with surprise. That's exactly right. You want to show me how you'd fix it? For the next hour, Joseph worked alongside the blacksmith, demonstrating knowledge that impressed both Peterson and the small crowd that gathered to watch. His familiarity with horses was obvious, but more than that, he showed an intuitive understanding of the animals that couldn't be faked. Where'd you learn to read horses like that? Peterson asked as they finished the job. Spent a lot of time around them in St. Louis, Joseph replied carefully. Horses are horses whether they're pulling wagons or carrying riders. True enough. Tell you what, if you're serious about learning the trade, come by tomorrow morning. I'll give you a trial period, see how you work out. As they walked back toward the wagon, Catherine struggled to contain her amazement. In less than 2 hours, Joseph had not only avoided detection, but had actually impressed one of Cedar Ridge's most respected craftsmen. His knowledge of horses, gained through a lifetime of Comanche horsemanship, translated perfectly to the settler context. But their success brought new challenges. Employment meant daily contact with the townspeople, constant opportunities for his disguise to be discovered. More troubling, it meant Joseph would be contributing to the community that considered his people mortal enemies. You don't have to do this, Catherine whispered as they prepared to leave town. We could say you've changed your mind, decided to move on. Joseph shook his head firmly. I need to understand them. This is the only way. Their return journey passed in thoughtful silence, both of them processing the implications of what they had accomplished. Joseph had successfully infiltrated Cedar Ridge, but the victory felt incomplete. He was still an outsider looking in, accepted conditionally and only as long as his deception held. That night, as they sat by Catherine's fire planning for the challenges ahead, Joseph asked the question that had been troubling him all day. If they knew what I really was, would any of them still treat me the same way? Catherine considered the question seriously. Some might. Jake Peterson cares more about a man's skill than his heritage. Father Miguel preaches that all souls are equal in God's eyes, but most ... She shrugged helplessly. Fear makes people cruel, Joseph. And there's been too much killing on both sides for forgiveness to come easily. Then maybe it's time someone tried to change that. The determination in his voice sent a chill down Catherine's spine. She was beginning to realize that Joseph running Wolf was not content merely to observe and understand. He was planning something far more ambitious and dangerous than simple deception. As he prepared for his first day of work in Cedar Ridge, Joseph performed another ceremony in the oak grove, but this time his prayers were different. Instead of asking forgiveness for betraying his heritage, he asked for wisdom to bridge two worlds that seemed destined for eternal conflict. He didn't yet know how he would accomplish such an impossible task, But as he watched the stars wheel overhead in patterns his grandfather had taught him to read, Joseph O'Malley, who had once been running Wolf, began to believe that maybe, just maybe, understanding could triumph over hatred. The next morning, he would begin his life as a member of the community that had left him for dead. And perhaps, if he was very careful and very brave, he could plant seeds that might eventually grow into something unprecedented on the Texas frontier. Peace. Transformation was complete, but the real journey was just beginning. Joseph O'Malley was about to discover that crossing into the unknown world of his enemies was only the first step in a much larger adventure, one that would challenge everything both peoples believed about justice, forgiveness, and the possibility of redemption. Part 5. The transformation process. 3 months into his new life as Joseph O'Malley, running Wolf had become something he never expected. Indispensable to Cedar Ridge, Jake Peterson's blacksmith shop had become the unofficial gathering place for men who needed their horses shod, their tools repaired, or simply wanted to escape their wives for an hour of masculine conversation. Joseph moved among them with quiet competence, his skill with horses earning grudging respect from even the most skeptical ranchers. "Boy's got magic hands with the animals," declared Samuel Hayes, watching Joseph calm a fractious stallion that had kicked 2 other men. "Never seen anything like it." What the townspeople attributed to natural talent was actually the result of a lifetime spent among the Comanche, where horsemanship was not just a skill but a sacred art. Joseph could read the subtle signs of an animal's mood, could communicate through touch and posture in ways that seemed mystical to settlers who viewed horses primarily as tools. But his growing acceptance came with unexpected complications. Success brought visibility, and visibility brought danger. "Joseph," called a cheerful voice from across the town square. Mary Beth Wilson, the banker's 18-year-old daughter, approached with the determined stride of a young woman who had set her cap for a particular man. "Mother's wondering if you'd like to join us for Sunday dinner this week." Joseph felt his stomach tighten with familiar anxiety. Mary Beth had been pursuing him with increasing boldness, encouraged by her parents, who saw a hard-working young man with promising prospects. The attention was flattering, but terrifying romantic entanglement would mean closer scrutiny, more intimate questions about his past, greater opportunities for his deception to crumble. "That's very kind, Miss Wilson, but I wouldn't want to impose," he replied carefully, keeping his voice neutral and polite. "Nonsense. Mother loves having company, especially such pleasant company." Mary Beth's blue eyes sparkled with barely concealed interest. "Besides, you can't spend every Sunday reading with Mrs. O'Malley. A young man needs social activity with people his own age." The irony was bitter. Joseph had indeed been spending Sundays with Catherine, but not reading settler literature. Instead, he had been teaching her Comanche words, sharing stories of his people's traditions, maintaining connections to a heritage he could only express in complete secrecy. "I'll consider it," he said diplomatically, knowing he had no intention of accepting. As Mary Beth walked away with a satisfied smile, Joseph caught the eye of Benjamin Crawford, the same man who had left him to die 4 months earlier. Crawford frequented the blacksmith shop, his suspicious nature making him study every newcomer with careful attention. But so far, the patrol leader showed no sign of recognizing the dying Comanche boy in the competent young blacksmith. "Popular fellow," Crawford observed, his tone neutral but his eyes sharp. "Young lady like that doesn't take interest in just anyone." "She's very kind," Joseph replied carefully. "Wilson family's got influence in this town. Banking, land deals, connections to Austin. Man could do worse than catching their attention." Crawford studied Joseph's face. "Course, they'd want to know all about a suitor's background. Family history, that sort of thing." The warning was subtle but unmistakable. Crawford might not recognize him, but the patrol leader's instincts sensed something amiss. Joseph nodded respectfully and returned to his work, but he could feel Crawford's gaze following him as he moved around the shop. That evening, Joseph shared his concerns with Catherine over their simple dinner of stew and cornbread. The kitchen had become their sanctuary, the one place where running Wolf could emerge from behind Joseph's carefully constructed facade. "Crawford suspects something," he said, speaking in Comanche as he often did when they were alone. "Not the truth, but he knows I'm not what I appear to be." Catherine set down her spoon, worry creasing her features. "Maybe it's time to consider leaving. You've learned what you wanted to know about our people." "Have I?" Joseph challenged gently. "I've learned how they treat someone they think is one of them. But I haven't learned how they might treat someone they know is different, if that person earned their respect first. That's too dangerous. If you're discovered, if I'm discovered as I am now, yes, they'll kill me," Joseph agreed. "But what if I could change their minds about my people before they discover the truth?" Catherine stared at him in alarm. "You're thinking of telling them?" "Eventually. When the time is right. When I've proven that everything they believe about the Comanche is wrong." The audacity of the plan took Catherine's breath away. Joseph was proposing to deliberately reveal himself to a community that would view his very existence as proof of treachery, betting his life on the hope that months of friendship and respect could overcome a lifetime of hatred and fear. "That's not just dangerous," she said finally. "That's suicide, maybe, or maybe it's the only way to stop the killing." Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion outside, horses approaching at speed, urgent voices calling out in the darkness. Joseph immediately moved away from the window while Catherine went to investigate. "Mrs. O'Malley," Sheriff Davies called from horseback. "We need every able-bodied man. There's been a raid on the Henderson Farm. Comanche war party hit them around sunset." Catherine's blood turned to ice. "How bad?" "Bad enough. Family's safe, but they lost most of their livestock and their barns burned. We're organizing pursuit parties now." Through the window, Joseph could see more riders gathering in the moonlight, angry men with rifles and rope, the kind of mob that dispensed frontier justice without benefit of trial or mercy. If they caught the raiders, there would be no prisoners taken. "I'll wake Joseph," Catherine called back. "We'll be right there." She returned to the kitchen to find Joseph already changing into his settler clothes, his face grim with understanding. This was the test neither of them had wanted. He would be expected to ride with a posse hunting his own people, to help track down warriors who might include his own father or cousins. "You don't have to do this," Catherine whispered urgently. "You could stay here, claim illness, and have Crawford wondering why the young blacksmith suddenly became a coward when there was real danger." Joseph shook his head. "I have to go. But God help me, I don't know what I'll do if we actually catch them." The posse that assembled in Cedar Ridge's main street numbered 30 men, armed with rifles and burning with righteous anger. Joseph recognized most of them customers from the blacksmith shop, men who had come to trust and respect his work. Now they were united in their desire to kill people who shared his blood. Judge Morrison, despite his age, had insisted on leading the expedition personally. His weathered face was set in lines of granite as he addressed the assembled riders. "These devils think they can raid our families with impunity," he declared, his voice carrying clearly in the still night air. "We're going to teach them different. Any man who wants to turn back can do so now with no shame." No one moved. The trail was easy to follow. The raiders had made no attempt to hide their passage, driving stolen cattle toward the river with the confidence of warriors who feared no pursuit. Joseph found himself riding beside Tom Bradley, the same young man who had argued for mercy during his own encounter with Crawford's patrol. "First time tracking Comanche?" Bradley asked as they followed the clear hoofprints through moonlit grass. Joseph nodded, not trusting his voice. "Don't let it get to you too much," Bradley continued. "I know it's hard, thinking about what they do to prisoners, but we're the good men here. We're bringing justice." The terrible irony of the situation pressed down on Joseph like a physical weight. These men, his friends and neighbors, genuinely believed they were righteous defenders of civilization. In their minds, the Comanche were not people defending their homeland but savage animals to be exterminated. The complexity of the conflict, the broken treaties, the encroachment on traditional hunting grounds, the cycle of raid and reprisal that had been building for decades was invisible to them. After 2 hours of hard riding, they reached the Brazos River crossing where the trail disappeared into the water. Judge Morrison called a halt while scouts examined the opposite bank for sign of the raiders' emergence. "They could have gone anywhere from here," Crawford reported after a thorough search. "Current running fast enough to wash out tracks, and there's a dozen good exit points downstream." Frustration rippled through the posse. They had ridden hard on the promise of swift justice, only to lose their quarry at the water's edge. Some of the men began discussing the possibility of continuing the search in daylight, but Joseph could see the futility of it. The raiders were long gone, already safely back in territory where a pursuing posse would become the hunted dot as they prepared to return to town empty-handed. Joseph felt a complex mixture of relief and guilt. His people had escaped, but his presence with the posse felt like betrayal, regardless of the outcome. He was walking a tightrope between two identities, and each step threatened to send him plummeting into an abyss from which there would be no escape. The ride back to Cedar Ridge was subdued, the men's earlier enthusiasm dampened by failure. But if Joseph expected their anger to dissipate, he was quickly proven wrong. "This can't continue," declared Ezra Miller as they reached the town limits. "These savages are getting bolder, hitting closer to home. We need to do something permanent." "What are you suggesting?" Sheriff Davies asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. "Organize a real expedition. Not just chase them after they've already struck, but go after their camps. End this once and for all." Murmurs of agreement rose from the assembled riders. The idea of taking the fight to the Comanche rather than simply reacting to their raids clearly appealed to men frustrated by their inability to protect their families. Judge Morrison raised his hand for silence. "That's a decision for cooler heads in daylight. But I won't lie to you, it's been discussed before. Maybe it's time to discuss it again." As the posse dispersed, Joseph felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. The fragile peace he had been trying to build was about to shatter, replaced by a war that would consume everything he cared about on both sides of the conflict. The transformation process he had undergone was more complete than he had realized. He was no longer simply Running Wolf disguised as Joseph O'Malley. He had become something new, a bridge between worlds that were preparing to destroy each other. A man with feet planted in two different realities and loyalties, pulling him in opposite directions. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of his ability to maintain his dangerous balance. The townspeople would want to plan their campaign against his people, and he would be expected to contribute his skills to their cause. The young blacksmith who had earned their respect would be called upon to help plan the destruction of the Comanche Nation. As Joseph finally returned to Catherine's cabin in the pre-dawn darkness, he realized that his transformation was approaching its most critical phase. Soon he would have to choose not just between his two identities, but between two peoples he had come to love in different ways. The legend they would speak of in years to come was being forged in these moments of impossible choice, shaped by a young man's desperate attempt to find a third path between vengeance and surrender. But first, he would have to survive the storm that was coming, a storm that would test not just his courage, but his faith in the possibility that understanding could triumph over hatred, that mercy could overcome the hunger for revenge that had consumed the frontier for so long. The transformation was nearly complete. What emerged from it would either be the salvation of both peoples, or the destruction of everything Joseph O'Malley, who had once been Running Wolf, held sacred. The War Council convened on a sweltering August morning in Cedar Ridge's courthouse, where 30 of the town's most influential men gathered to plan what they called the final solution to the Comanche problem. Joseph sat in the back row, his presence requested by Jake Peterson, who valued his insights about horses and frontier conditions. The irony of a Comanche warrior helping plan the destruction of his own people was lost on everyone except Joseph himself. Judge Morrison commanded the room from behind, the massive oak desk that had served as the seat of frontier justice for over a decade. Maps covered every available surface, marked with red ink to show raid locations, suspected Comanche camps, and supply routes. The accumulated data painted a picture of systematic warfare that had been escalating for months. "Gentlemen," Morrison began, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "we've tried patience. We've tried defensive measures. We've tried negotiation through intermediaries. Nothing has worked. The raids are increasing in frequency and boldness, and our families are living in constant fear." Benjamin Crawford stood to address the assembly, his weathered face grim with determination. 3 farms hit in the past month alone. Henderson lost 50 head of cattle. Morrison's place begging your pardon. Judge lost 2 prize horses and damn near lost young Timothy when he tried to stop them. Joseph's blood ran cold at the mention of the judge's grandson. The boy was only 12, barely younger than Joseph had been when the settlers left him for dead. The cycle of violence was consuming children on both sides, creating orphans and grieving parents with ruthless efficiency. "What exactly are you proposing?" asked Dr. Harrison, the town's physician and one of its more moderate voices. Crawford unrolled a large map of the region, pointing to a series of marked locations along the Brazos River. "Our scouts have identified 3 major encampments within a day's ride of here. Winter's coming, which means they'll be concentrated, less mobile. We hit all 3 simultaneously fast, hard, and complete." "You're talking about attacking women and children," Dr. Harrison said quietly. "I'm talking about ending this war before it ends us," Crawford snapped back. "Those women raise the warriors who burn our homes. Those children grow up to raid our families. Sometimes you have to cut the root to kill the weed." Joseph felt physically sick as murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. These were men he had come to know personally: Jake Peterson, who had taught him advanced metalworking techniques; Tom Bradley, who had shared stories of his sweetheart back east; Ezra Miller, who always asked about his health after the long hours in the smithy. Good men, by their own lights, planning genocide because they couldn't imagine any other solution. "What about the territorial governor?" asked Father Miguel, who had been sitting silently in the corner. "Surely such an action requires official sanction." "The governor is 300 miles away, dealing with politics in Austin," Judge Morrison replied dismissively. "By the time we get approval, another dozen families will be dead or scattered. Sometimes local action is the only action." Joseph knew he had to speak, had to find some way to prevent the catastrophe that was taking shape before his eyes. But any argument against the plan would immediately raise suspicions about his loyalties. Instead, he chose a different approach. "Begging your pardon, sir," he said, standing slowly and feeling every eye in the room turn toward him. "But have you considered the tactical difficulties of what you're proposing?" Crawford frowned. "Explain yourself, boy." Joseph moved toward the map, his mind racing as he improvised a strategy that might delay or complicate their plans. Simultaneous attacks on 3 camps separated by miles of rough country. That means dividing our forces, coordinating timing. Without telegraph communication, and assuming that our intelligence about camp locations is accurate and current. "The boy has a point," admitted Sam Hayes, who had military experience from the Mexican War. "Comanche camps move frequently." "What our scouts saw last week might be empty ground by the time we arrive. Moreover," Joseph continued, warming to his theme, "attacking in winter means dealing with weather delays, reduced visibility, horses struggling through mud or snow. And if any of the camps receive warning, if our approach is detected, or if We fail to achieve complete surprise. We could find ourselves fighting a running battle across terrain they know better than we do. The room fell silent as the men considered these complications. Joseph could see doubt creeping into faces that had been set with determination moments before. "What would you suggest instead?" Judge Morrison asked, his tone suggesting genuine interest in Joseph's tactical insights. This was the moment Joseph had been building toward, the chance to propose an alternative that might prevent bloodshed while maintaining his cover. A demonstration of force rather than an attack. Ride to the largest camp under a flag of truce. Make it clear that we have the numbers and equipment to destroy them, but offer terms instead. Terms? Crawford's voice dripped with skepticism. What kind of terms? Relocation. Compensation for damages. A formal boundary agreement. Something that gives them a way to surrender their pride intact while removing the threat to our families. The suggestion created an immediate uproar. Voices rose in anger and disbelief as men who had lost livestock, property, and sometimes relatives rejected the idea of negotiating with their tormentors. "You want us to reward them for burning our homes?" shouted Miller. "I want us to end the killing," Joseph replied firmly. "War is expensive in blood and treasure. If we can achieve our objectives without losing men, isn't that preferable to a battle that might cost us friends and neighbors?" Father Miguel spoke up unexpectedly. "The young man speaks wisdom. Our Lord counseled us to be wise as serpents and gentle as doves. Perhaps there is merit in attempting diplomacy before resorting to the sword." But Crawford was shaking his head vigorously. "You're all forgetting something crucial. You can't negotiate with savages. They don't understand anything but force. Show them weakness, and they'll see it as an invitation to attack again. How do we know they're savages if we've never tried to talk to them as equals?" Joseph asked quietly. The question hung in the air like a physical presence. Several men shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the challenge implicit in Joseph's words. If the Comanche were truly unreasonable savages, then negotiation was impossible. But if they weren't, if they were people defending their homeland with the same desperation that motivated the settlers, then perhaps understanding was possible. Judge Morrison studied Joseph's face with sharp attention. "You seem very confident about their capacity for reason, young man. That's an unusual perspective for someone who's never encountered them personally." Joseph felt the trap closing around him, but forced himself to remain calm. "I've been reading about them, sir. Mrs. O'Malley has books about frontier conflicts, Indian policies, treaties that have been tried in other territories. The Comanche aren't the first native people to face displacement, and some of those conflicts ended in negotiated settlements." The transformation process he had undergone was more complete than he had realized. He was no longer simply Running Wolf disguised as Joseph O'Malley. He had become something new, a bridge between worlds that were preparing to destroy each other. A man with feet planted in two different realities and loyalties, pulling him in opposite directions that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of his ability to maintain his dangerous balance. The townspeople would want to plan their campaign against his people, and he would be expected to contribute his skills to their cause. The young blacksmith who had earned their respect would be called upon to help plan the destruction of the Comanche Nation. As Joseph finally returned to Catherine's cabin in the pre-dawn darkness, he realized that his transformation was approaching its most critical phase. Soon he would have to choose not just between his two identities, but between two peoples he had come to love in different ways. The legend they would speak of in years to come was being forged in these moments of impossible choice, shaped by a young man's desperate attempt to find a third path between vengeance and surrender. But first, he would have to survive the storm that was coming, a storm that would test not just his courage, but his faith in the possibility that understanding could triumph over hatred, that mercy could overcome the hunger for revenge that had consumed the frontier for so long. The transformation was nearly complete. What emerged from it would either be the salvation of both peoples, or the destruction of everything Joseph O'Malley, who had once been running Wolf, held sacred. The War Council convened on a sweltering August morning in Cedar Ridge's courthouse, where 30 of the town's most influential men gathered to plan what they called the final solution to the Comanche problem. Joseph sat in the back row, his presence requested by Jake Peterson, who valued his insights about horses and frontier conditions. The irony of a Comanche warrior helping plan the destruction of his own people was lost on everyone except Joseph himself. Judge Morrison commanded the room from behind the massive oak desk that had served as the seat of frontier justice for over a decade. Maps covered every available surface, marked with red ink to show raid locations, suspected Comanche camps, and supply routes. The accumulated data painted a picture of systematic warfare that had been escalating for months. "Gentlemen," Morrison began, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "we've tried patience. We've tried defensive measures. We've tried negotiation through intermediaries. Nothing has worked. The raids are increasing in frequency and boldness, and our families are living in constant fear." Benjamin Crawford stood to address the assembly, his weathered face grim with determination. 3 farms hit in the past month alone. Henderson lost 50 head of cattle. Morrison's place begging your pardon. Judge lost 2 prize horses and damn near lost young Timothy when he tried to stop them. Joseph's blood ran cold at the mention of the judge's grandson. The boy was only 12, barely younger than Joseph had been when the settlers left him for dead. The cycle of violence was consuming children on both sides, creating orphans and grieving parents with ruthless efficiency. "What exactly are you proposing?" asked Dr. Harrison, the town's physician and one of its more moderate voices. Crawford unrolled a large map of the region, pointing to a series of marked locations along the Brazos River. "Our scouts have identified 3 major encampments within a day's ride of here. Winter's coming, which means they'll be concentrated, less mobile. We hit all 3 simultaneously fast, hard and complete." "You're talking about attacking women and children," Dr. Harrison said quietly. "I'm talking about ending this war before it ends us," Crawford snapped back. "Those women raise the warriors who burn our homes. Those children grow up to raid our families. Sometimes you have to cut the root to kill the weed." Joseph felt physically sick as murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. These were men he had come to know personally: Jake Peterson, who had taught him advanced metalworking techniques; Tom Bradley, who had shared stories of his sweetheart back east; Ezra Miller, who always asked about his health after the long hours in the smithy. Good men, by their own lights, planning genocide because they couldn't imagine any other solution. "What about the territorial governor?" asked Father Miguel, who had been sitting silently in the corner. "Surely such an action requires official sanction." "The governor is 300 miles away dealing with politics in Austin," Judge Morrison replied dismissively. "By the time we get approval, another dozen families will be dead or scattered. Sometimes local action is the only action." Joseph knew he had to speak, had to find some way to prevent the catastrophe that was taking shape before his eyes. But any argument against the plan would immediately raise suspicions about his loyalties. Instead, he chose a different approach. "Begging your pardon, sir," he said, standing slowly and feeling every eye in the room turn toward him. "But have you considered the tactical difficulties of what you're proposing?" Crawford frowned. "Explain yourself, boy." Joseph moved toward the map, his mind racing as he improvised a strategy that might delay or complicate their plans. Simultaneous attacks on 3 camps separated by miles of rough country. That means dividing our forces, coordinating timing. Without telegraph communication, and assuming that our intelligence about camp locations is accurate and current. "The boy has a point," admitted Sam Hayes, who had military experience from the Mexican War. "Comanche camps move frequently." "What?" our scouts saw last week might be empty ground by the time we arrive. Moreover, Joseph continued, warming to his theme, attacking in winter means dealing with weather delays, reduced visibility, horses struggling through mud or snow. And if any of the camps receive warning, if our approach is detected, or if we fail to achieve complete surprise, we could find ourselves fighting a running battle across terrain they know better than we do. The room fell silent as the men considered these complications. Joseph could see doubt creeping into faces that had been set with determination moments before. What would you suggest instead? Judge Morrison asked, his tone suggesting genuine interest in Joseph's tactical insights. This was the moment Joseph had been building toward, the chance to propose an alternative that might prevent bloodshed while maintaining his cover. A demonstration of force rather than an attack. Ride to the largest camp under a flag of truce. Make it clear that we have the numbers and equipment to destroy them, but offer terms instead. Terms? Crawford's voice dripped with skepticism. What kind of terms? Relocation. Compensation for damages. A formal boundary agreement. Something that gives them a way to surrender their pride intact while removing the threat to our families. The suggestion created an immediate uproar. Voices rose in anger and disbelief as men who had lost livestock, property, and sometimes relatives rejected the idea of negotiating with their tormentors. "You want us to reward them for burning our homes?" shouted Miller. "I want us to end the killing," Joseph replied firmly. "War is expensive in blood and treasure. If we can achieve our objectives without losing men, isn't that preferable to a battle that might cost us friends and neighbors?" Father Miguel spoke up unexpectedly. "The young man speaks wisdom. Our Lord counseled us to be wise as serpents and gentle as doves. Perhaps there is merit in attempting diplomacy before resorting to the sword." But Crawford was shaking his head vigorously. "You're all forgetting something crucial. You can't negotiate with savages. They don't understand anything but force. Show them weakness, and they'll see it as an invitation to attack again. How do we know they're savages if we've never tried to talk to them as equals?" Joseph asked quietly. The question hung in the air like a physical presence. Several men shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the challenge implicit in Joseph's words. If the Comanche were truly unreasonable savages, then negotiation was impossible. But if they weren't, if they were people defending their homeland with the same desperation that motivated the settlers, then perhaps understanding was possible. Judge Morrison studied Joseph's face with sharp attention. "You seem very confident about their capacity for reason, young man. That's an unusual perspective for someone who's never encountered them personally." Joseph felt the trap closing around him, but forced himself to remain calm. "I've been reading about them, sir. Mrs. O'Malley has books about frontier conflicts, Indian policies, treaties that have been tried in other territories. The Comanche aren't the first native people to face displacement, and some of those conflicts ended in negotiated settlements." 12 warriors, like Henderson said, Crawford reported quietly. "They've got the woman tied to a tree on the far side of their camp. Horses are picketed nearby. They're cooking something, probably settling in for the night. Can we get close?" "Enough for a clean shot?" asked Jake Peterson. "Maybe, but if we miss, or if they have time to react, the woman's dead." Crawford lowered the spyglass, his face grim. "We need a distraction. Something to draw their attention while we position." "Shooters." Judge Morrison, who had insisted on joining the pursuit despite his age, spoke with quiet authority. "I won't see Martha Henderson die because we acted hastily. What kind of distraction are you thinking about?" Crawford studied the enemy camp thoughtfully. "Someone rides in under a flag of truce, keeps them talking while we get into position. It's risky, but it might work." "I'll do it," Joseph heard himself say, the words escaping before he could stop them. Every man in the posse turned to stare at him. Crawford's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "You? Why?" Joseph's mind raced. knowing that this was the moment when all his carefully constructed lies would either hold or crumble. "I speak some of their language," he said carefully. "Picked it up from traders and travelers passing through St. Louis. Might be able to communicate better than someone who doesn't know any Comanche words." It was a dangerous admission, but not an impossible one. Frontier towns often produced individuals who learned fragments of native languages through trade or captivity experiences. Crawford continued to study Joseph's face, clearly sensing something. Amiss but unable to identify exactly what. "It's suicide," Tom Bradley protested. "They'll kill you the moment you ride into that camp." "Not if they think I'm there to negotiate," Joseph replied. "Give me 15 minutes to get them talking, then move into position. When you're ready, fire a signal shot and I'll hit the ground." Judge Morrison nodded slowly. "It's a sound plan. But son, you understand what you're volunteering for. If something goes wrong, Mrs. Henderson doesn't deserve to die for my mistakes," Joseph said simply. As the men began positioning themselves around the grove, Joseph felt the weight of impending revelation settling on his shoulders. Whether he survived the next hour or not, his life as Joseph O'Malley was about to end. The only question was whether what emerged from the wreckage would be triumph or tragedy. He rode slowly toward the Comanche camp, a white cloth tied to his rifle barrel, his heart pounding with recognition as he identified the warriors around the fire. They were from his own band. He could see his cousin Swift Arrow among them, and the war leader Stone Fist, his father's friend and hunting companion. The warriors rose as he approached, weapons ready but not immediately threatening. Joseph stopped just at the edge of their firelight and raised his hand in the traditional greeting. "I come in peace to speak with your war leader," he called out in fluent Comanche. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. Swift Arrow's eyes widened with shock, and Stone Fist stepped forward, his weathered face creasing with amazement and something that might have been joy. "Running Wolf," Stone Fist breathed. "We mourned you as dead." "I have walked the shadow path," Joseph replied, using the traditional phrase for surviving mortal danger. "But I have returned with wisdom that may save us all." The reunion with his kinsman felt surreal after months of hiding his true identity. These men represented everything he had been forced to deny about himself, his heritage, his people, his place in the world. But they also represented the violence and raiding that had made peaceful coexistence impossible. "You wear the clothes of our enemies," Swift Arrow observed, his tone suspicious. "You ride with their symbols. What has happened to you, cousin?" Joseph dismounted slowly, knowing that every word of this conversation was crucial not just for Martha Henderson's life, but for any hope of preventing the war that was about to consume both peoples. "I have lived among them," he said simply. "Learned their ways, earned their trust. They are not the demons our grandfathers described, just as we are not the savages they believe us to be." Stone Fist gestured toward the captive woman, who was watching the exchange with growing hope as she realized the conversation was about her fate. "This woman's people left you to die. Why do you speak for them?" "Because one of their women saved my life," Joseph replied. "Because I have seen that there are good people on both sides of this conflict, and bad people on both sides as well. Because the killing has to stop somewhere." The sound of a rifle being cocked made everyone tense. Behind the warriors, Benjamin Crawford emerged from the brush with his weapon trained on Joseph's back. "Step away from them, boy," Crawford ordered coldly. "I don't know what game you're playing, but it ends now." Joseph turned slowly, meeting Crawford's eyes with calm resignation. "No game, Mr. Crawford. Just a young man trying to prevent a war." "You're one of them," Crawford said, and it wasn't a question. "The boy we left to die. Somehow you survived, and somehow you've been hiding among us for months." The accusation hung in the air like a physical presence. Joseph could hear other members of the posse moving through the brush, taking positions that would soon turn the grove into a killing ground. "Yes," Joseph said simply. I am Running Wolf of the Comanche people. I am also Joseph O'Malley, blacksmith of Cedar Ridge. I am both, and I am neither. I am what becomes possible when people choose understanding over hatred. Crawford's finger tightened on the trigger. You're a spy and a traitor. You've been living among us, learning our weaknesses, planning attacks. I've been living among you, learning your strengths, Joseph corrected. Learning that you love your families the same way we love ours. Learning that you fear for your children's safety the same way our mothers fear for theirs. Learning that peace is possible if both sides can find the courage to step back from the edge of the cliff. Stone Fist had been listening to this exchange. With growing understanding, his knowledge of English allowing him to follow the conversation. Now he spoke in Comanche, his voice heavy with sadness. Is this why you did not return to us, Running Wolf? Have you chosen their world over ours? Joseph answered in English, ensuring that everyone present could understand his words. I have not chosen sides, Uncle. I have chosen peace, but peace requires sacrifice from everyone. He turned to Stone Fist, switching back to Comanche. Release the woman. Take no more captives, steal no more horses. Let this be the last raid, and in return? Stone Fist asked. Joseph looked at Crawford, then at the faces of the other settlers emerging from concealment around the grove. Men he had worked beside, shared meals with, called friends. Their expressions showed confusion, betrayal, and anger. But also something else, uncertainty about what to do with the situation that challenged everything they thought they knew. In return, Joseph said, speaking to both groups simultaneously, we try something that has never been attempted on this frontier. We try to build understanding instead of walls. We try to find justice that doesn't require death. Judge Morrison emerged from the shadows, his rifle lowered, but ready. You're asking us to trust people who have burned our farms and stolen our livestock. I'm asking you to trust a young man who has proven his worth to your community, Joseph replied. I'm asking you to judge my people by the same standards you would want them to judge yours, by our best examples, not our worst. The standoff stretched in tense silence, weapons trained in every direction. Two peoples balanced on the knife's edge between war and peace. Martha Henderson sat tied to her tree, watching her fate being decided by forces beyond her control. Finally, it was Tom Bradley who broke the stalemate. The young man who had once argued for mercy stepped forward, his rifle pointed at the ground. I knew there was something different about you, he said to Joseph, but you've been a good friend and a good neighbor. That has to count for something. Stone Fist studied the young settler with interest. You speak for your people? I speak for myself, Bradley replied. But I'm not the only one who's gotten tired of burying friends and neighbors. One by one, other members of the posse began lowering their weapons, not in surrender, but in uncertainty about whether the young man they had come to respect was still their enemy, now that they knew his true identity. Judge Morrison stepped forward, his weathered face thoughtful. You've put us in an impossible position, son. If we let you go, we're betraying everything we've sworn to protect. If we kill you, we're murdering someone who's never done us harm. Then, find a third choice, Joseph said quietly. Be the men who chose a different path. The negotiation that followed was unlike anything that had ever occurred on the Texas frontier. Two groups of armed men, separated by language, culture, and bitter history, began the delicate process of finding common ground while a captive woman's life hung in the balance. Joseph served as translator and mediator, helping both sides understand not just each other's words but their underlying hopes and fears. Stone Fist revealed that the recent raids had been driven by desperation. The band was starving as buffalo herds dwindled and traditional hunting grounds became inaccessible. The settlers learned that the Comanche were not mindless savages, but people struggling to survive in a changing world. As the sun set over the cottonwood grove, an agreement began to emerge. Martha Henderson would be released unharmed. The Comanche would cease raiding in exchange for access to hunting grounds during specific seasons. Disputes would be mediated through designated representatives rather than resolved through violence. It was imperfect, fragile, and entirely dependent on the willingness of both sides to honor their commitments. But it was also something unprecedented. Peace agreement negotiated not by distant officials, but by the people who would actually live with its consequences. As Martha Henderson was freed and reunited with the rescue party, Joseph found himself facing a choice he had been dreading. Crawford, despite his obvious reluctance, had agreed to the terms, but his final words to Joseph were ominous. "This doesn't change what you are, boy. Spy, traitor. Call it what you want. There'll be consequences when we get back to town." Joseph nodded calmly. "I understand." But the choice was never about avoiding consequences. It was about making sure the consequences served life instead of death. The ride back to Cedar Ridge was unlike any homecoming Joseph had ever imagined. He rode between two worlds, accepted by neither but no longer hiding from either. Some of the settlers treated him with wary respect, others with open hostility. The Comanche had allowed him to leave with the rescue party, but he knew he could never fully return to his old life among them either. But as they crested the final hill overlooking the town, Joseph realized that he had accomplished something remarkable. A woman who should have died was alive and free. Two peoples who had been preparing for war were instead preparing for peace. The legend they would tell in years to come would not be of a great battle or a heroic death, but of a young man who had the courage to be something new. Catherine O'Malley was waiting on her porch when they arrived, her face bright with relief and pride as she saw Joseph riding safely back to the home they had shared. Whatever happened next, they had planted seeds of understanding that might grow into something beautiful. The boy who had been left for dead in the desert had become Joseph O'Malley, respected member of Cedar Ridge. Now Joseph O'Malley was becoming something else entirely, a bridge between worlds, a living symbol that enemies could become neighbors if they chose understanding over fear. The legend of the Comanche boy who was saved by a widow's love, and who became the foundation of an impossible. Peace was just beginning. But already, in the changed faces of the men who rode beside him, Joseph could see that some legends were worth the price of everything they cost. The new beginning stretched ahead of them, uncertain but full of hope, exactly the way all the best legends start. 5 years had passed since that October evening in the Cottonwood Grove, and Cedar Ridge had become something unprecedented on the Texas frontier, a town where former enemies worked side by side in an uneasy but enduring peace. The morning sun cast long shadows across Main Street as Joseph no longer hiding behind either of his names but simply known as the Bridge. To most townspeople, made his rounds through the community that had become his life's work. At 21, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had faced impossible choices and emerged with his integrity intact. The boy who had been left for dead had grown into someone who commanded respect from both peoples, though that respect had been hard-won and was constantly tested. His first stop was the expanded blacksmith shop, where Jake Peterson had made him a full partner after 2 years of exemplary service. The business had thrived beyond anyone's expectations, partly because Joseph's reputation for understanding horses had spread throughout the region, but mainly because the shop had become the unofficial headquarters for managing the complex logistics of the peace agreement. "Morning, Bridge," called out Samuel Hayes, leading a limping mare toward the shop. "Picked up a stone somewhere between here and Austin. Hope you can work your magic again." Joseph smiled at the familiar greeting. The townspeople had started calling him Bridge during his second year back, when his role as mediator between the communities had become indispensable. Some meant it with affection, others with grudging acceptance, but all of them understood that their unusual prosperity depended on his unique position between two worlds. As he examined the mare's hoof, extracting the embedded stone with practiced Joseph reflected on how much had changed since that desperate gamble in the grove. The peace agreement had held, though not without constant effort and occasional crises that required delicate negotiation. Both sides had kept their essential promises. The Comanche raids had ceased, and the settlers had honored the seasonal hunting agreements that allowed the band to sustain themselves as the buffalo herds continued their tragic decline. But perhaps the most remarkable change was in the people themselves. Children who had grown up fearing the very word Comanche now played alongside Swift, Arrow's son, during the monthly trade gatherings. Settlers who had once spoken of extermination now asked Joseph to teach them basic words in his native language. The transformation hadn't been universal or complete, but it had been real enough to change the fundamental character of the community. "Joseph," a young voice called from across the street. 10-year-old Timothy Morrison Judge, Morrison's grandson, came running toward the shop with the boundless energy of childhood. "Grandfather says to ask if you'll be joining us for Sunday dinner this week." The invitation represented one of the most surprising developments of the past 5 years. Judge Morrison, once the most vocal advocate for military action against the Comanche, had become one of Joseph's strongest supporters after witnessing the practical benefits of the peace agreement. The monthly dinners at the Morrison house had evolved into informal planning sessions where community leaders discussed everything from crop rotation to territorial politics. "Tell your grandfather I'd be honored," Joseph replied, ruffling the boy's hair. Timothy had been born the year after the peace agreement was signed, part of a generation that would grow up thinking cooperation between former enemies was normal rather than miraculous. As Timothy ran off to deliver the message, Catherine O'Malley approached from the direction of the church, her weekly basket of supplies for Father Miguel balanced carefully in her arms. At 47, she moved with the same quiet grace that had first caught Joseph's attention during his recovery. But now her face carried the satisfaction of someone whose impossible gamble had paid off beyond her wildest dreams. "Busy morning already?" she asked, noting the line of customers waiting for Joseph's attention. "The usual. 3 horses to shoe, 2 wagon wheels to repair, and Mrs. Henderson wants me to look at that plow blade again." Joseph wiped his hands on his leather apron, smiling at the woman who had become more than his savior. She had become his true family. "How was your visit with Father Miguel?" Catherine's expression grew thoughtful. "He's received another letter from the territorial capital. They're still trying to understand how we've managed to avoid the conflicts that are tearing apart other frontier communities. Officials want to send investigators to study our methods." This was a conversation they'd had many times over the past 2 years. Word of Cedar Ridge's unusual peace had spread throughout Texas and beyond, attracting attention from government officials, newspaper reporters, and curious observers who couldn't believe that settlers and Comanche were coexisting successfully. Most of these inquiries were well-intentioned, but Joseph and the community leaders had learned to be cautious about outside interference. "What did you tell Father Miguel?" Joseph asked. "Same thing I always tell him, that peace isn't a method you can copy from one place to another. It's something that grows from specific people making specific choices in specific circumstances. You can't replicate it by following a formula." Joseph nodded, understanding the deeper wisdom in Catherine's words. Dozens of communities had sent delegations to study Cedar Ridge's success, but none had been able to duplicate it in their own territories. They focused on the formal agreements, the trade relationships, the dispute resolution mechanisms, all the visible structures that supported the peace. But they missed the essential foundation, the willingness of individuals to see their supposed enemies as human beings worthy of understanding. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted their conversation. A group of Comanche riders was approaching. From the northwest, not the monthly trading party, which wasn't due for another week, but a smaller group, moving with the urgent purposefulness that usually meant important news. Joseph recognized the lead rider immediately. Windspeaker. An elder from a band that lived 2 days. Journey from Cedar Ridge. The old man's presence could only mean that something significant had happened in the broader Comanche territory. Something that might affect the fragile peace they had worked so hard to maintain. Bridge, Windspeaker called out as he dismounted, using the English title that had become Joseph's name among his own people as well. I bring words from the Great Council. There are changes coming that will test everything we have built here. Joseph felt the familiar tightness in his chest that accompanied news from the outside world. Their small experiment in coexistence existed in a bubble of relative isolation, but they couldn't remain separate from the larger forces reshaping the American frontier forever. What kind of changes? Joseph asked in Comanche, aware that several townspeople had gathered to observe the conversation. Windspeaker glanced around at the watching settlers, then made a decision that demonstrated how much trust had developed over the years. He switched to his carefully learned English, ensuring that everyone present could understand his words. The White Father in Washington has made new laws. All native peoples must move to special lands far from here. Soldiers are coming to enforce these laws. Some bands will fight, others will flee. None will be allowed to remain in their traditional territories. The news hit the gathered crowd like a physical blow. Joseph felt the careful structure of their peace agreement trembling as the implications became clear. If federal troops arrived to enforce removal orders, their local arrangements would become irrelevant. The Comanche would be forced to choose between abandoning their homeland or fighting a war they couldn't win. Judge Morrison, who had been approaching to discuss some minor trading dispute, arrived in time to hear Windspeaker's announcement. The old judge's face went pale as he understood what federal intervention would mean for his community. "How much time do we have?" Morrison asked. "Perhaps 2 seasons," Windspeaker replied. "Maybe less." The soldiers move slowly, but they move without stopping. Joseph's mind raced through possible responses, each more desperate than the last. They could try to hide the Comanche presence during military inspections, but that would require the entire community to risk federal charges of harboring fugitives. They could attempt to get official recognition for their peace agreement, but that would mean navigating a bureaucracy that viewed all Indian treaties as temporary conveniences. They could help the band relocate to the designated territories, but that would mean destroying everything they had built together. "There might be another way," Judge Morrison said slowly, his legal mind working through possibilities that others hadn't considered. "If we could document the success of our arrangement, present it as a model for federal policy rather than an obstacle to it, ... You're talking about politics," Catherine observed. "That's dangerous ground for a small community." "Everything we've accomplished here is the dangerous ground," Morrison replied. "But maybe it's time to take those risks on a larger stage." Over the following weeks, Cedar Ridge became a hive of unprecedented activity as the community prepared for what everyone understood might be their final opportunity to preserve the peace they had created. Letters were written to territorial officials, newspaper editors, and sympathetic politicians. Detailed records were compiled showing the economic benefits of the peace agreement, the reduction in violence, the successful integration of former enemies. Joseph found himself at the center of it all, his unique position making him the natural spokesman for their cause. But as he prepared for what might be his first journey beyond the Texas frontier, he wrestled with doubts about whether their small miracle could survive transplantation to the hostile soil of national politics. The answer came in the form of a letter from Senator James Wellington of Massachusetts, a progressive politician who had heard about Cedar Ridge through intermediaries and wanted to see their experiment firsthand. Wellington would visit in the spring, just weeks before the expected arrival of federal troops. "One chance," Judge Morrison said as they planned for the senator's visit. "One opportunity to convince someone with real influence that what we've built here is worth preserving." Joseph spent the winter months preparing for conversations that would determine not just his own fate, but the future of everyone who had chosen to believe that understanding was stronger than hatred. He practiced explaining complex cultural concepts in simple terms, learned the political vocabulary that might resonate with Eastern sensibilities, and most importantly, gathered the stories of individuals whose lives had been transformed by the peace agreement. When Senator Wellington finally arrived on a warm April morning, accompanied by a small entourage of staff and newspaper correspondents, Joseph was ready for the most important performance of his life. But as he watched the distinguished visitors dismount from their carriages and survey the bustling town square, where Comanche and settler children played together without concern, he realized that the most powerful argument for their cause wasn't anything he could say. It was simply the reality of what they had created, a community where former enemies had become neighbors, where fear had been replaced by understanding, where the impossible had become an everyday routine. The legend of the Comanche boy who had been left for dead was entering its final chapter, but Joseph no longer knew how that chapter would end. Success might mean preservation of their peaceful experiment, but it might also mean transformation into something unrecognizable under the weight of federal oversight. Failure would certainly mean the destruction of everything they had built, but it might also mean that their example would inspire others to attempt similar bridges between divided peoples. As Senator Wellington approached to begin their crucial conversations, Joseph felt the weight of 5 years' worth of hopes and dreams settling on his shoulders. The boy who had learned to be a bridge between worlds was about to discover whether that bridge was strong enough to span the greatest divide of all, the chasm between local success and national policy. Whatever happened next, the legend would endure. But legends, Joseph had learned, were less important than the lives they touched and the possibilities they created for those brave enough to believe that peace was worth any sacrifice. The story was far from over, but the ending, whatever it proved to be, would be worthy of the impossible beginning that had started with a dying boy's desperate prayer and a widow's choice to answer it with love. Senator Wellington's carriage departed Cedar Ridge on a golden October afternoon, 25 years to the day after Joseph's first desperate entry into the town that would become his destiny. Now 46, Joseph stood beside the same cottonwood grove where his fate had been decided, watching the dust settle on what might have been the most important week in Cedar Ridge's history. The senator's visit had exceeded everyone's expectations. Wellington had spent 6 days documenting their peace agreement, interviewing both Comanche and settler families, observing the monthly trade councils that had become the foundation of their prosperity. Most importantly, he had witnessed something that couldn't be fabricated or performed. A community where children grew up believing that cooperation between different peoples was natural. The boy Timothy Morrison, Wellington had mused on his final evening, asked me why other places couldn't simply make friends the way Cedar Ridge had done. When a 10-year-old can't understand why peace is considered impossible, perhaps we adults have been asking the wrong questions. Joseph's response had come from 25 years of hard-won wisdom. Children see what is, Senator. Adults see what they've been taught to fear. Now, 3 months later, as snow began to dust the Texas plains, Joseph received the letter that would determine whether their experiment would survive or perish. Wellington's bill had passed Congress by a narrow margin, creating the Cedar Ridge Demonstration Territory, a federal preserve where the peace agreement would be protected and studied as a potential model for other frontier communities. It wasn't everything they had hoped for. Federal oversight would bring bureaucrats, regulations, and constant scrutiny. But it was enough. The bridge between worlds would endure. Catherine, now 57 but still spry enough to tend her expanded garden, found Joseph reading the letter by the firelight. Her hair had gone completely silver, and lines of laughter marked the corners of her eyes, evidence of joy that had been impossible during her early years of widowhood. Good news? she asked, settling into the chair Patrick had carved so many years ago. The best, Joseph replied, passing her the official documents. We're to become a permanent territory under special federal protection. No forced relocations, no military interventions. What we've built here will be preserved. Catherine read in silence, her expression growing more amazed with each paragraph. Finally, she looked up with tears in her eyes. That boy I found dying in the desert has just changed the course of American Indian policy. That widow who chose mercy over fear changed the course of everything. Joseph corrected gently. As winter deepened, news of the Cedar Ridge model spread. Beyond Texas, delegations arrived from as far away as Montana and Arizona, representatives of communities still locked in cycles of violence and retribution. Most came skeptical and left believers, carrying back not just the formal structures of their peace agreement, but the deeper understanding that enemies could become family. If both sides chose courage over comfort, Joseph found himself traveling more frequently, consulting with territorial governors and tribal leaders who wanted to attempt their own versions of the Cedar Ridge experiment. Not all succeeded. Peace, he learned, required specific combinations of leadership, timing, and mutual desperation that couldn't be manufactured. But enough attempts bore fruit that a network of peaceful communities began to emerge across the frontier. The legend grew with each telling, but Joseph noticed that the details changed depending on who was sharing the story. In some versions, he became a mythical figure who could speak to animals and see the future. In others, he was a cunning spy who had manipulated both sides for personal gain. The truth, that he had simply been a frightened boy who chose understanding over hatred, seemed too simple for people who preferred their heroes larger than life. Legends aren't about truth, Wind Speaker observed during one of their monthly councils. They're about what people need to believe is possible. On a spring morning in 1897, as wildflowers painted the Texas plains in brilliant colors, Joseph received visitors who would mark the final chapter of his story. Swift Arrow, now a grandfather himself, arrived with a delegation that included Stone Fist's son and several young warriors who had grown up in the peace Joseph had helped create. Cousin, Swift Arrow said, using the formal address reserved for important occasions, the Great Council has chosen you for a great honor. You are to be named a peace chief, the first in our history to receive this title while living among the white settlements. The ceremony took place in the Cottonwood Grove where Joseph had first chosen peace over vengeance. Representatives from both communities gathered as Wind Speaker performed the ancient rituals, acknowledging Joseph's unique role as a bridge between worlds. But as the eagle feathers were placed in his hair and the sacred paint was applied to his face, Joseph felt the weight of time pressing against his shoulders. He was 47 now, no longer the wounded boy who had stumbled between cultures, but not yet the elder who would see this story to its natural conclusion. What comes next? Young Timothy Morrison asked after the ceremony. Now 15 and preparing for college back east, Timothy represented the generation that would inherit the peace Joseph's generation had created. You do, Joseph replied simply. The bridge was never meant to be one person. It was meant to be an idea, the idea that understanding is stronger than fear, that peace is worth whatever it costs to achieve. As the sun set over Cedar Ridge on that spring evening, Joseph walked slowly through streets where Comanche and settler families lived side by side, where children played games that combined traditions from both cultures, where the impossible had become inevitable through the patient work of people who refused to accept that hatred was humanity's natural state. The boy who had been left for dead had become a man who left behind something more valuable than any legend, proof that enemies could become family, that bridges could be built across any divide, that love was indeed stronger than fear. 20-5 years later, when historians would write about the transformation of the American frontier, they would note that the bloodiest conflicts ended not with military victories, but with individuals who chose a different path. They would study the Cedar Ridge model, analyze its political implications, and debate its broader applications. But in the end, they would always return to the same simple truth. Sometimes legends begin not with grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but with a dying boy's whispered prayer and a lonely woman's decision to answer it with kindness. The bridge Joseph built between worlds would outlast his own life, carried forward by the children who couldn't imagine why peace had ever seemed impossible. And perhaps, in that passing of impossible dreams from one generation to the next, lay the true meaning of every legend worth telling. The Comanche boy who was left for dead by settlers had indeed become legend, not through conquest or revenge, but through the quiet courage of choosing love over fear, understanding over hatred, hope over despair. In Cedar Ridge, where peace had taken root in soil watered by too much blood, that legend would live forever. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.